10:30 a.m., January 11th, 2013, in Valdosta, Georgia. During morning gym class at Lowndes High School, a few students climbed on top of the vertical gym mats to do schoolwork when they discovered a pair of white socks sticking slightly from the top of one of the mats. Thinking someone was playing a joke, they called a few others over, and eventually the gym teacher joined them. He pulled a few of the mats down so that he could reach the mat in question, and pulled it on its side. What he discovered was a male student dead inside the rolled-up gym mat. Authorities were alerted, and that very same day, the police department made a statement that they were sure no foul play had taken place in the death of this child. 5 years later, the family is still fighting for answers about what really happened to their son. You're listening to Creep It Real, and today we are discussing the mysterious death of 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson.
Creep It Real is a weekly podcast where we present our theories of the subjects we cover based on our interest and research. Some material may be graphic and disturbing, so proceed with caution.
Hey everybody, we're back again with a new case. This case isn't as popular as it should be, we feel. Nonetheless, it's very interesting, very mysterious, and we have been beating our heads against the wall trying to find anything and everything we possibly can. Unfortunately, the case of Kendrick Lamar Johnson is shrouded again in mystery.
Yeah, it is a really controversial case, we have noticed. It's honestly also difficult to find a straight answer about certain things. It's just there's so much mysterious circumstances going on here.
Lackadaisical police attitude, mishandling the crime scene. We got everything and anything that could go wrong.
Yeah, so let's begin with Thursday evening of January 10th, 2013. Jackie Johnson reported her son Kendrick missing when he was not home by 10:30 p.m. The last time that Kendrick was seen was at school that day. So the following morning, when she still hadn't heard anything from him, she went up to the school to talk to the administrators to see if they had any information on where he may be or if they had seen him or anyone else had seen him. And when she was speaking to the administrators, she began to notice some kids were kind of gathering in the hall and talking about a dead body. So she found out soon after that the students had found a young man who had been in a rolled up mat.
Students had climbed up on top of some of the mats that were pushed together and happened to notice feet sticking out of one of the other mats. Thinking it was a joke, unfortunately it was not. So a teacher was alerted and they had pulled the mat down in question and pulled it on its side. What they discovered was a male student, Kendrick Johnson.
Yeah, he had been laying head down in a vertical mat for over 20 hours. His arm was over his head, kind of covering his face. His other arm was kind of tucked beside him with his elbow down by his ribs. And he had blood coming from his mouth, nose, and ears. He was wearing a white shirt, blue jeans. He didn't have shoes on because the pair of shoes that he had been wearing were wedged in with him beside his ankles in the mat. He had blood on his shirt, blood and vomit coming out of his mouth. His face was swollen, his eyes were swollen, his pupils were fixed and dilated. So obviously he had been deceased for a while, as rigor mortis had set in already. And the teacher told all the students to get out of the gym and call the authorities.
He was just an average high school student. He played sports. He had no reports of being like a bad kid or anything, you know.
Yeah, he played football,
basketball.
He got decent grades. He lived with both of his parents, Jackie and Kenneth. They seemed to have a very loving relationship. Everything at home seemed to be really pretty good. He wasn't in any state of distress that day, as kids had reported that who had classes with him said he was acting totally normal, his normal cheerful self. He was a little quiet, as he was in general, and he was just a happy guy. that day, the day that he went missing, he was not acting out of the norm for himself.
These big old wrestling mats, I'm sure everybody's familiar with them if you'd ever had been in a high school before. They're large and flimsy, and I guess the kids, they claim that a lot of them didn't want to pay for a locker, so they would just put their belongings in these mats and go retrieve them between classes.
Yeah.
I guess I could see this happening, but I mean, the mats were big. They were 6 feet tall. Unless they were turned on their side, I don't really see why a kid would throw their belongings in there.
So what I read was the locker fees were like $10 to $15 a semester, and so kids would lift up the bottom of the mat to put their stuff in these spaces. And then when asked about it, they stated they never saw anyone climb on top of these mats ever to reach inside. They only saw people, and they themselves had only lifted up the mat so that they could retrieve their items.
Right, because it would make no sense to throw them in the middle of the mat, because that would be a huge to-do to get your things out of there.
So the paramedics and police arrived on the scene and began to take pictures and assess the body. The coroner, unfortunately, was not called for 6 hours after the police arrived on scene, which is illegal in the state of Georgia and pretty ridiculous if you ask anybody. He was pretty upset, and when he arrived on the scene, he noted that the crime scene was not being processed correctly. It was contaminated by students, teachers. The people processing the scene were not wearing foot coverings, and they don't wear protective foot coverings to protect their own shoes. They wear that so that they don't contaminate the scene, but nobody was wearing them. There are multiple pictures where you see them beside his body wearing their shoes without any covering. They weren't bagging and tagging all the evidence at the scene. Some of it was just being completely disregarded and not even considered as evidence. And the body laid halfway out of a gym mat for all those hours before the coroner arrived for examination.
Sheriff Pine made a press release that evening claiming that foul play was not suspected. The coroner, Bill Watson, said he would not have ruled accident that soon. So next day at Valdosta Crime Lab, Kenneth Johnson, his father, identified the body, said warm air was coming from the room where the body was stored in. And I don't know what significance that would have.
Yeah, so first off, I take extreme umbrage with the sheriff declaring the day of finding the body that they were certain that there was no foul play. They hadn't eliminated a ton of evidence yet, and yet they were making public declarations that there was no foul play suspected, which I find to be insulting to the whole situation altogether, to his family, to Kendrick himself. That's just ridiculous. And yeah, so I guess the warm air aspect, you have to think it's going to help accelerate decomposition and perhaps affect how certain things would be able to be identified in an autopsy.
Right.
But there have been, and I don't want to talk badly about the parents because I understand their frustrations and complete agony, but there are some things that they have said that aren't accurate. And so I am not sure. We have Kenneth Johnson's word that room was warm instead of being cooled as it should be in the crime lab.
Right.
So that Thursday, the day that Kendrick went missing, there were 2 separate sports practices held in the old gym where his body was found, and they did not supposedly see, hear, or smell anything out of the normal in that gym.
This school also had multiple surveillance cameras all around the school, including in the old gym that I don't know if it wasn't used a lot, but there was still cameras in there, and it had captured some footage from that day, and there is speculation that the footage was actually tampered with. The school should have hired their own analysis specialist of the footage, but the police kind of told the school, like, well, just give it over to us. We'll analyze it and look for things. And if you watch the footage, it is very strange.
Yeah. So they took 5 days to give it over for the first thing. Okay. So they probably, from what I've read, the police should have identified what they wanted and demanded it and gotten it pretty quick, and instead left it up to the school to just kind of determine what to give and when to give it to them. There's a period from 11 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. where multiple cameras in that area recorded nothing at all, so it was just a total blackout, even though 2 other cameras in that area recorded students going into the gym and in the hallway. So 2 cameras in the gym black out for 1 hour and 5 minutes. That blackout ends at 1:09 when Kendrick enters the gym gym, and then 2 other nearby cameras were missing 2 hours and 15 minutes, and that blackout ended at 1:15, and then the other camera at 1:16. At the same time that these were blacked out, there were cameras in the vicinity that would have recorded kids coming into the gym, and they did, but yet there was no recording of the inside of the gym at that time.
So at 7:30 a.m., the camera shows Kendrick walking into the school, and at 1:09 p.m., he walks into the old gym, according to the embedded timestamp. 3 minutes later, more students come into the old gym. No one saw or heard Kendrick, though. In that 3-minute window, he slipped into a mat, and supposedly he was unable to be heard or seen. Nobody saw him jump in there. I think if he was stuck, there would be, yelling happening, commotion.
Rocking around,
Yeah.
right, exactly.
Anything to get out of that mat.
Like, he would be struggling.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's like, that leaves a very short time span, a little window of time for him to get on top of that mat, drop a shoe, and get stuck inside of there without anyone seeing or hearing him. Like, just is not likely.
Yeah.
I saw a forensic video analyst. His name was Grant Fredericks, and he works for the U.S. Justice Department as a consultant, and he's a contract instructor for FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. And he stated that when he reviewed the files that he was given from the police department, that they were not original files and they should not be relied on by investigators for the truth of the video.
Yeah.
Like he said, there was time missing, and the video had been altered in a number of ways, he said, primarily the image quality and then the info loss. There were a number of corrupt files that were not processed correctly. He stated, "It's highly suspicious, especially considering how long it took the police to receive them and left the school district to decide what to include, not police." So the video is disputed widely by people on all sides of the argument of what happened to this young man.
So another thing about this footage, if you watch it, these videos are available on YouTube, is the sporadic popping in and out of these kids, which you would think, I understand that a lot of security cameras aren't the best quality and people seem to kind of have jerky movement, which, I think we've all seen that. But the way these kids pop in and out of the frame is very suspicious to me. And the video analysis guy did say that it could be explained by the sporadic movement of the students because, kids are hopped up on Mountain Dew and Starburst. But if you watch it, are they so sporadic that they
cut in all of a sudden? Yeah. Just in the middle of the camera. It definitely seems odd.
Yes.
For sure. So there's also video of earlier in the day of Kendrick standing in line at lunch, and a boy, I'm not going to say the name yet, a boy comes through and goes past him, and then purposefully, it seems like the only reason he even went past him was so that he could circle back around and push him. And if you watch it, which is also online, you can tell it's not in a friendly way. That was a kind of aggressive, he wasn't trying to start a fight necessarily, but you can see in Kendrick that he is trying to kind of just ignore this guy altogether and not even pay attention to him when he walks by the first time, and he circles back around and pushes him, and it's not friendly. It just isn't. Not at all.
And you know how guys are, when they want to say hi to their buddy, they might sneak up and kind of give him an arm shove or bump, and then the guy turns around and, hey dude, what's up, buddy punches and whatnot. But like you said, this was a, hey, what the heck type deal, not a, hey, friend.
It was kind of instigating something, but he didn't respond. So that's about unfortunately, in all of the hours of video footage that they received, that's all the evidence of Kendrick that they really had.
Right.
So now we're going to move on to the evidence that was found at the scene. The first being the 2 Nike shoes of Kendrick's that were wedged into the mat with him. So the police claim that he kicked these shoes off in his struggles to get out of the mat, and I just do not think that's likely. When you see those shoes and you see the picture, and we can post it on our Instagram, they look like they were wedged into that mat beside his legs after he was already in there. It just does not make any sense the way that you see them, that he just kicked them off. And why would they have been kicked off in the first place?
Right. There was a picture of a shoe, actually, and it's kind of weird to look at because, as you mentioned before, that there was blood pooling, and this shoe had blood around it, but there was no, actual blood on the shoe.
Yeah. So
does the shoe have, a protective force field around it?
So that shoe was supposedly directly underneath Kendrick in that hole in the mat, and it was sitting in a pool of blood, but had no blood on the shoe.
Right. And then we have that other shoe. So we have all these shoes.
There's a lot of shoes.
And this shoe actually has some sort of red spatter on it. And the police they totally blew it off as not able to determine what the substance was on the shoe, that the shoe wasn't even a viable source of evidence. So they blew it off, and I mean, they didn't even bring the shoe in really for processing because it wasn't.
Right. Supposedly the splatter wasn't blood, it was paint.
Yeah.
It just matched blood. Mm-hmm. So we haven't really talked about it at this point, but the police had immediately made this determination that Kendrick got on top of those mats in order to retrieve the shoes that he shared with a friend for gym class and fell inside, or that he dropped a shoe and leaned in to retrieve it from the top. And that was their determination of how he got in that mat. And I just have to tell you, that is the most ridiculous thing. If you look at the pictures of these mats, and I have seen people say, well, he was 5'9", so he could have gotten it. Mm-hmm. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. First of all, a 5'9" boy is not going to be able to have the arm span of a 6-foot mat, okay? If you look at these mats laid on their side and you just see how long it is, it's absolutely absurd to say that somebody thought that they could reach through the top and reach the ground from the top of the mat when it stood on its side. It does not make sense.
Right.
It does not. I mean, someone would have to be holding his feet and like lowering him down through this hole that he would have to be squeezing through, sort of, in order to retrieve that shoe from the top. It just does not make sense.
Well, and let's talk about those mats real quick. There was a ton of the mats that were a white, and they look like they were like a section mat. Like if you were to roll out, they weren't perfectly round. They had
they were like made up of like a lot of individual long sections that formed a cohesive mat that you roll up.
And the mat Kendrick was found in is more of the mat that I'm familiar with, and I think a lot of people would recognize. But it was the only mat that was just a solid like sheet that you would roll up, and the other mat, the hole in the center, was extremely small.
Yeah. So yeah, I spoke with some people who had experience with these wrestling mats. It would be possible if the mats were tightly packed into the corner of the room for somebody to accidentally get wedged inside and not be able to knock the mat over in their struggles. But there's some photos of the crime scene that don't really line up with that theory, besides the fact that the theory of Kendrick going after a shoe became the only theory, and nothing else was ever even considered, and that is an absurd theory to begin with. So while it's possible, there's a slim chance that he could have actually just gotten himself stuck in this mat. We'll talk more about this, but it just is unlikely, and it's insulting and really lazy police work. It's just kind of like, good, that's a good enough excuse, so let's move along. He did it to himself. Good enough, not good enough if that's your family, probably, but we'll continue on. There was blood spatter on the wall, and a detective stated to multiple different news agencies and whatnot that it was too old to be related to the case. How they determined that, just looking at it, I'm not sure. And Shai and I both talked about the fact that a school isn't going to just let blood be like flung willy-nilly and not clean it up, as it's a biohazard.
Well, that's why you hire janitors. That's their job, is to go through the school and clean up gross messes.
Right. Like, you don't leave vomit on the floor. You don't leave blood splattered on a wall in a gym. And they supposedly collected this blood as evidence, determined it wasn't Kendrick's, and that was it. That was where they ended that investigation on that blood.
It's not right for them to say that the blood was too old to test or to be evidence, because it only takes about 45 to 60 minutes for blood to dry in an average temperature room. This is a temperature controlled school. The blood could have dried an hour after it was on the wall and looked like it was old and crusty. It's, you know what I mean? It doesn't need to be fresh, wet blood to be evidence.
Especially when we're saying that this young man was laying in this mat for over 20 hours. That blood had plenty of time to dry. And if it wasn't Kendrick's, whose blood was it spattered on the wall?
Exactly.
And maybe that could help you in some way in your investigation if you're worried about investigating this situation more than just saying, oh, it's an accident. What I found really interesting about the crime scene was there was his yellow folder, a school folder, was laying kind of strewn off to the side, and it was like kind of crumpled up, which I know that may sound insignificant, but why would his folder be like crumpled almost? Doesn't look like, I don't think that's how the folder being crumpled up is suspicious to me. Why was it crumpled up? Did he crumple his folder up before he jumped up on the mats to get his shoes? I don't get it. And his school book laid feet away too, kind of strewn.
So there was also a Hollister hoodie that was never identified, and it wasn't ever identified as Kendrick's either. And there was a red substance on the cuff of the sweater, and we had talked about it before. Ditching your sweater, the cuff is so close to your hands. If your hands are the weapon, Yeah. So there's blood on the cuff of the sweater, but again, it wasn't considered to be good enough evidence, or it was an unidentified substance.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't even collect that hoodie as evidence. No. Period.
No.
I mean, shouldn't everything laying in the gym be collected as evidence?
Everything should be collected and identified as
right.
Whose is what.
Yes, exactly. And especially if there's unidentified substance on the sleeve. Who knows? Maybe it's nothing, but it could be something.
Well, it happened to be a reddish color.
Exactly. And in my opinion, you eliminate those things with actual scientific elimination.
Right.
Okay. But anyway, so the last bit of evidence at the scene that we're going to talk about is in the girls' bathroom. There were multiple bloody tissues that were in the trash can.
Yeah, that supposedly weren't Kendrick. Again, the blood was never fully identified. It was said to be an injury from one of the color guard girls, that she had gotten injured at practice, but nobody came forward to say, hey, yeah, that was me.
Right. So, cool.
The gym is just festering with evidence, blood, and weird substances, and nobody is thinking that it's a coincidence or strange.
Right. It's just, somebody, even though we don't know who the female is, she never came forward, that was a female's blood because it was in the girls' bathroom. It can't have anything to do with Kendrick, even though we just found a dead body in the gym.
Yep.
Under suspicious circumstances. So the police made the determination that Kendrick went to get those shoes, like I said. So the mats were stacked in the corner. He couldn't lift them because they were all stacked together, and he couldn't lift them as he usually did. So he climbed up on top and decided to retrieve them, and he either dropped one and went to retrieve it, or he fell in. But again, there was only one shoe, so where did the other shoe go? If he had dropped a shoe and then had to retrieve that shoe, where did the other one go? And again, he's not Stretch Armstrong, so how in the world did he suspect that him being 5'9", he was going to be able to reach down to the bottom of the floor and through the mat to get the shoe? I just don't think that happened. And if he did, no one in there saw him struggling or heard him or anything at all. He didn't see a mat rocking around or him screaming. It's just nonsense, in my opinion. And they somehow were able to determine there was no foul play that day, which that's very interesting to me. Yeah, as we stated, no students ever saw or did it themselves. They never saw anybody try to retrieve anything from those mats from the top. They always tipped them up from the bottom and got the stuff out. So,
Lowndes County incident report by Officer Michael Adams stated that the face was severely disfigured and also swollen. The only identifying feature to the victim was his long dreadlocks.
Yeah. So both of us have really looked into this as much as we can, because it's not easy, but it makes sense that his face would be swollen if he was laying in that upside down position for so long. But the severely disfigured part, I find that is not necessarily common. And, that is also subjective to that police officer. But I find it interesting that he did feel the need to say that he was severely disfigured instead of just saying that he was severely swollen. He made the distinction between the two.
Upon trying to find photos of people that had died from just being strung upside down, you really couldn't find a whole lot of just the face. Like Ashley said, that being swollen in the face would definitely be something that would happen from dying from that position. But the only thing I could find, interestingly enough, was a photo of a before and after of Mussolini's face. But he had been beaten so bad in the face, it actually did kind of resemble the way Kendrick's had looked.
Yeah.
It was gross, but it was just like, this is like kind of eerily similar.
It really was. And at first I thought, oh, that's just from hanging. I was like, okay, well, and then I read further that no, he had been beaten.
Yeah.
And they looked so similar. And I'm just saying, in all the pictures in articles that I found about other upside down deaths, they didn't look, of course they look swollen. Of course there's lividity in their face and there's blood that has pooled and their eyes were swollen, but it just didn't look quite the same. There was just some, like the cop said, it looked like his face was disfigured.
Yeah.
And I mean, like I said, he made a point to put that in the incident report. So that's up to you to, feel how you want about it, I guess. So the autopsy was performed by medical examiner Marianne Gaffney Kraft. So an odd aspect of this was that I read multiple different accounts that said his clothes were missing when he arrived at the medical examiner for his autopsy. I read other reports saying that he had clothes when he arrived for his autopsy. But from what I read, the missing clothes was actually true as far as the Valdosta crime lab, the medical examiner, and the individual who transported Kendrick all blamed each other for the loss of the clothes somewhere between the crime lab and the medical examiners for the autopsy. Take that how you will. But supposedly he arrived wearing nothing and only clutching headphones in his hand.
So why would he have missing clothing? We have to ask ourselves this, but why would it be so back and forth between yes, he had them and no, he did not?
Right. And, I have pictures of the crime scene where there is blood on his clothes, and perhaps that blood got there upon moving his body or maybe in his struggles, but it's defying gravity either way about it. It's, if he's upside down and he's bleeding from his eyes, nose, and mouth, how is blood traveling up to get down onto his shirt, like near his waist and even below it?
Yeah.
So perhaps those clothing items could tell a story that somebody doesn't want to be told.
Well, I can see his face and hair being caked in blood if that was the case, if he was upside down bleeding from his facial orifices, but on his chest and torso, I don't see it happening.
Mm-mm. And I have photos of that too. So, he has blood on his abdomen. I just don't understand how hanging upside down and dying that way is, because there is something called purge fluid where when you die and you're upside down, that's why he began to bleed from his eyes, nose, and mouth. But why did that purge fluid get on his clothing?
We don't know.
When he's upside down. So like I said, he arrived with headphones that he was clutching in his hand. One of the wires on those headphones were broken. And also, why did he die clutching those headphones instead of using his hands to try and get himself in a different position or get out of that mat if he fell in there like they claim and he was struggling to get out? I don't know why he would continue to hold on to broken headphones, which they also didn't find the other broken piece of the headphone beneath him in that mat.
He was also found with a cell phone, and some speculation has been that he was pulling out his cell phone to maybe try to call for help, and that's how the wire ended up around his hands. But it was also said that the cell phone was not in use and that he mainly used it as like an MP3 player for his music. So if that was the case, what would be even the point in struggling to get your phone out of your pocket?
No, there wouldn't be. So in this autopsy report, she cites 4 or 5 abrasions or contusions on his hands, and they're about 1/8 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch, and yet she states that there were no signs of trauma, which those abrasions on his hands may not be trauma, but they also possibly are signs of trauma. So there's yet again another example of just giving this absolute answer of accidental death or accidental situation altogether, when those abrasions on his hands could very well be defensive wounds that are not being considered as signs of trauma. And that, to me, is really disturbing. She just made that declaration just straight away. Like, even if you wanted to say these abrasions are possible signs of trauma but not likely, that I would have appreciated that more than just no signs of trauma at all. And the other part of that is that the paramedic report stated that he had bruising on his chin and near his neck. And again, while it might be from just being in that position and maybe his chin was touching the mat for so long, or that, again, I just don't understand how you can take those bruises, all of this information, and just be giving the absolute determination accident, no defense wounds, no signs of trauma. He died from, as she decided decided the cause of death was accidental positional asphyxiation, meaning he got himself in this position and could not move and died because he couldn't breathe and was inverted for so many hours.
So I know beforehand you had mentioned that this cause of death isn't something that like a healthy, able-bodied individual would really experience. Like, tell us what would be a person that's more prone to this positional asphyxia.
Well, there are predetermining factors, I believe is how they word it, and I'll talk about it in a little while too again, that if you die from positional asphyxia, you must consider these predetermining factors, which are intoxication by alcohol or drugs, obesity, mental illness, prior injury, or not having the mental faculties to get yourself out of this position. And it also must be considered that you could not reposition yourself in any way in order to be able to breathe more easily or get yourself in a better position.
Right.
And I find that to be pretty interesting, considering how and why was he unable to reposition himself in order to be able to get into a better position that he didn't die. But again, we'll talk about it.
Talk about it here in a little bit, because it's really interesting once you see the photos, how
right.
Yeah.
It just doesn't add up as the police want their nice open and shut case to be. So the family was not satisfied with the conclusion of that first autopsy. They had Kendrick's body exhumed for a second autopsy.
They actually, and they paid for this all themselves too. The total cost for somebody to get a body exhumed and then the presence of the funeral director at the exhumation, which can cost an additional $1,000 itself. So it's about $3,000 to $5,000 for the actual process, and then you add the funeral director having to be there, and then you add the next autopsy just to be exhumed. It's around $6,000.
Yeah, so the Johnsons are not a wealthy family. They're definitely working class. We're not talking about the Ramseys this week. They did not have a lot of money laying around to spend $6,000 for an exhumation of Kendrick or the autopsy, but they just did not find that first autopsy was satisfactory. So this time it was medical examiner Willie Anderson who performed the second autopsy, and he came to a different conclusion than the first autopsy. He stated that Kendrick died of heart attack brought on by blunt force trauma to the carotid artery in the back of his neck. He said that there was a previously undissected area at the right upper portion of his neck which shows hemorrhaging that went deep into the subcutaneous fat. He also found that all of Kendrick's organs had been missing and the body was stuffed with newspaper.
This isn't your typical practice. A lot of times funeral homes will use either cotton or sawdust in the mouth, the nose, and where the body cavities are, where organs would go. We looked it up, and it's not like they were doing anything illegal by using the newspaper, but it's thought to have been kind of a cheap, disrespectful route that they went. And I know it's hard to say because we've never been in that situation, but finding your child's body stuffed with newspaper like there's some dead animal on the wall would just probably be like heartbreak all over again.
Oh, yeah. It's an outdated practice, for one, and while it may just be that the funeral home is going a cheap route, and the other part of this is here we are again with a lot of confusion about the situation, because initially the funeral director stated that he never received the organs with the body. And then the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, came back and said, yes, he did. That was pretty much it. Then he changed the story to say that they were too decomposed to salvage. And I will say that in the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, the coroner, Bill Lowndes, said that the organs were too decomposed and they were disposed of before they were sent to the funeral home. So that was stated at some point, and then all this other stuff came out and all these different stories that kind of conflict with each other. It's just another one of the situations where it's like, what is the real truth here? It's like his clothes were missing, or were they not? His organs, were they there when he was sent to the funeral home, or were they not? Either way, they weren't there for the second autopsy. But you can't use that as, because I have heard people say, well, how did this second autopsy, how was it even performed very accurately if his organs were missing? Well, they use microscopic examinations of soft tissue and red blood cells to determine the condition of the organs, and that is how they do it. So that second autopsy found that there was no inflammation of his lungs or any significant edema, and the pulmonary findings that he found from examining those soft tissues and red blood cells consistent with rapid onset death and not consistent with accidental positional asphyxia.
A lot of people have speculated that Kendrick was a victim of the black market organ trade, but we think that's out there conspiracy theory, because if you look at pictures, they actually did post Kendrick's back.
Yes.
And he has no incision marks on his skin. So they weren't getting rid of his organs for that.
Right. Unless they extracted all of his organs through his nose. There's no way that he...
Well, we'll get into some aliens later. That's possible, okay?
But no. So not an organ trade situation, but definitely a sketchy situation. So following the discovery of Kendrick's body in the gym, his cousin Solomon Arrington, he was his cousin and his friend, he said that he received a threat via Facebook on the day that Kendrick went missing, and it said he was next to end in a body bag. He actually went to the police with this, so there is actual evidence of this happening, and they said it was just a joke, it wasn't a threat. There was also a boy named Dalton Ray Chauncey who said that he overheard two students admit to killing Kendrick, and he was subjected to hours of questioning by the police with no lawyer present. After hours of questioning, he changed the story and said he made it up. So that boy is now being indicted on felony false statement charges, but his mother stated to authorities, to the media, that she believes that her son was taken advantage of, that he's bipolar, and they held him in a room for all of these hours and coerced him into changing his story. Now, I'm not here to say one way or the other. That's obviously absolute hearsay.
So right now we're going to kind of get into the persons of interest that it's really interesting how this all played out. There were two boys in the school, the Bell brothers, who happened to be the sons of an FBI agent, right? So Brian Bell, he's the one that was thought to have an issue with Kendrick because there was an altercation on a bus on the way to a football game. Kendrick actually had a ride home with security while Bell drove home with his parents.
So according to friends of Kendrick, Brian Bell had ongoing issues with Kendrick and his friends. Even after this altercation on the bus, he had ongoing issues. He was reportedly a racist. According to police reports, there was a post on Facebook the day that Kendrick's body was found that said, "When you start messing, the goons' bodies start showing up." And a female also reported to the police in the months leading up to the death of Kendrick that multiple Facebook posts were made saying that this brother were going to start killing Kendrick and his friends, who had a group that they called themselves the CVC, the Clayettville Clique. Clayettville? Okay, the Clayettville, I'm like, so something. The Clayettville Clique, one by one. So he was going to start killing this CVC one by one. And while all of that is not anything that we can verify as fact, what we can verify as fact is that the Bell brothers were the only two students who refused to speak with the police following the murder. And their father gave the police their lawyer's number, and the lawyer said they were not going to be making any statements to the police regarding or answering any questions regarding this murder investigation. So that in itself opens them up to some serious scrutiny and speculation of their actions.
Right, because if you were innocent and had nothing to hide, you'd want to clear your name. So why wouldn't you give a police report? And out of all the students in the school, the only two that and the one that Kendrick had a problem with were the ones that would not give a police interview.
Right. So it's just suspicious as hell. So in 2015, the Bell brothers' home was raided by the FBI, and it was pretty intense, it appears. Right. I don't think it ever turned up anything, though. Nothing substantial.
Let's not forget that their father was an FBI agent. So it's speculated that this was like a department versus department type raid, because a lot of the times the FBI and other departments, they look out for each other. So this raid wasn't, I mean, it was like a 30-person raid with an armored truck. And it's weird, that the whole thing was captured on the family's home security system, which was installed by the FBI for their safety. You would think that if they wanted to get something out of the family and home, that they would have sent a couple agents over to just really have a sit-down talk with the family and parents and be like, look, man, like we really need to talk about this and get some information from you so that we can clear your name.
Right. Like all we want to do is clear your name.
Not treat them like terrorists.
Right. It was very dramatic. But like I said, it didn't really amount to anything. Later in 2015, Kendrick Johnson's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the school district, the Bell brothers, their father, local officials. It included dozens of individuals.
It was 38 respondents versus the Johnson family.
Yeah, and it was dismissed. They filed it again, and the Johnsons then withdrew it. But I believe there are reasons. They wanted to be able to allow the Department of Justice to investigate the case without their lawsuit getting in the way.
Right. And this was a $100 million civil lawsuit against the 38 individuals, which, like you said, the lawsuit was withdrawn. And unfortunately, what happened was the judge ordered the Johnsons pay about $292,000 in legal fees back to the defendants.
Right. So it's just horrifying to think that, in a desperate attempt to get some sort of justice for their son, that they're now ending up having to pay people who they feel may have mishandled or done anything nefarious. Now they're having to pay those people in regards to this case. It's pretty sad. They have had a few attorneys step down from the case, and I've seen a lot of people use that as proof of there not being an actual case here. And I just have to say that, they're, like I said, they're not a wealthy family. Maybe they don't have the money to pay these people. And if the case isn't receiving media attention or public attention anymore, then some of these people don't have the motivation perhaps to continue to work for them pro bono. I don't know that you can use that in itself as a reason why Kendrick was not murdered.
Right. Just
saying. To scale back a little, the Attorney General in 2013, Michael Moore, not the Michael Moore who makes documentaries, but the Attorney General at the time said that he wanted to do a federal review of the case. He eventually resigned, and the person that took over for him, Stephen Dettelbach, ended up resigning as well. So
that's a funny name.
So I wasn't even sure how I was going to say it. So his replacement, Stephen Dettelbach, also resigned from this case, which I find interesting. I'm not sure why they would resign. They have no connection to the family. So if they didn't want to work the case, or they didn't feel there was sufficient evidence, or there was no case whatsoever, they could have just said so. But just resigning from the case, I find that to be a little bit suspicious. I don't know what reason they have, but So the Department of Justice had been working this case for multiple years, and in 2016, they decided not to file federal charges in the case of Kendrick Johnson's death, citing insufficient evidence to determine that it was racially motivated murder. Mm-hmm. And in order to establish federal criminal civil rights violations, the government would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone killed Kendrick and also that it was racially motivated. That's a pretty high threshold there that they just couldn't meet. A spokeswoman for the Department of Justice gave the statement that they regret that they are unable to provide the Johnsons with a more definitive answer about Kendrick's tragic death. That was not this case is closed, we are telling you this was absolutely not a murder. They were simply saying there wasn't enough evidence to prove that it was a racially motivated murder. It's not to be used as this case is closed, like I have seen in so many different places.
So we have here the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, how it defines positional asphyxia. And we had touched on this earlier, but it's really interesting because we have Kendrick here, who is this able-bodied athlete, high school student. He's not a small kid. He's athletic and has no issues with his health. And it says here, it is quoted that it is imperative to recognize the precipitory or risk factors before labeling positional asphyxia as cause of death.
Yeah, so again, those precipitory factors are intoxication from drugs or alcohol, obesity, psychiatric illness, prior injury, or other impairment causing the inability to remove oneself from that position.
So he was unable to reposition himself. Why?
Right. So in order to have died from positional asphyxia, he must be unable to reposition himself. Why was Kendrick unable to position himself? Right. It is not because that mat was so tight that he couldn't move, because I will post a picture of, there was a good amount of room there where he could have adjusted himself, and he definitely had enough room to breathe because it was not constricting his torso so much that he couldn't expand his rib cage in order to breathe, which is what I guess they're trying to say happened.
Yeah.
It doesn't line up.
So Kendrick's body appeared to have a defensive posture, and then he had wounds covering his hands, which could have been like he was covering his face to defend himself from an attacker. And there was skin missing from his arm and shoulder, and there was also blood on his shirt.
Right. Like we kind of talked about in the beginning of this episode, his arm was kind of shielding his face, and that seems like a defensive posture to me. I don't really understand how, if you're struggling to get out of a mat that you got yourself stuck into, why you would shield your face and your other arm would be tucked down by your side. That does not scream of a young, athletic, able-bodied person struggling to get out of this mat. It seems like he was, like Shai just said, trying to shield himself from some sort of attack, perhaps.
The only other thing I can think of is how his arms ended up there is if he were to be put in the mat, you would have to have had put his arms up over his head to create more of a streamlined body, because he had 19-inch shoulders compared to the 14-inch hole in the mat. That's a 5-inch difference. You were not going to shove this kid in there with his arms at his side.
No.
So they could have shoved him in like a diving position, and one could have been pushed back in the process of shoving. Not saying that this is what happened,
but it's possible.
It's possible.
It's something to think about, just as much as him diving in to get a shoe by himself.
Right.
And again, the police and the paramedics on the scene in their initial report stated that his face was disfigured. Again, swollen, I understand. A little disfiguration maybe just from being so swollen, I understand, but it doesn't. If you look at his face in these like awful pictures that you would see, it doesn't just look like the other pictures that I found of people hanging upside down and dying. And of course, there's differences case to case, but it does just look like he got attacked.
Yeah. Actually, in the first autopsy, it wasn't reported, but in the second, they had concluded that there was actually bruising to one of his cheeks too as well. And these mats have to be soft enough to where you can throw people around and slam them on top of them without hurting them. Mm-hmm. If you're in it and it's such a small space and you don't have the ability to thrash around, I don't see how you're going to be able to bang your cheek into the side of a mat hard enough to where it's going to leave a bruise.
Right. So also, like we stated earlier, he had blood on his clothes, he had blood on his torso, he had blood on his chest, he had blood on his shoulder. So my husband's formerly a paramedic for 6 years, and he, in looking at the pictures, explained that the struggle in his struggles to get out of that mat, he may have blown blood from his nose or his mouth. But in my opinion, and then more when we discussed it a little further, he kind of came around to that when you're going to blow blood out of your nose or your mouth, it's going to spray in a more fine, misty kind of way than these large drops that you see on Kendrick's clothing and on his chest and on his shoulder and torso.
Right.
So as we said earlier, in determining a cause of death as positional asphyxia, that person has to have kind of like a precipitory factor that makes them unable to get themselves out of that position. So was perhaps the precipitory factor here that Kendrick was attacked and put into this mat unconscious and then was unable to move because he was unconscious and died? That's the theory that I have come to after reading and studying this case, is that perhaps he was attacked and put in this mat. You know, someone maybe didn't really intend to murder him, but it ended up happening. There are definitely cases in history of homicidal positional asphyxia that wasn't intended. They put someone in a position that caused their death, but they didn't intend for that to be the case.
There was a strange email that had been going around too as well that had stated that Kendrick has slept with Brian Bell's girlfriend, and that's kind of where the issues had started. But then later, it was said that that email was a complete hoax and didn't hold any weight in regards to the case. Either way, it shouldn't have been brushed off like that, and it should have been taken serious because we know how technology is, and we know how rumors get started, and it very well could have been the truth, but I guess we will never know.
So, in looking at all the evidence, there's a slim possibility that Kendrick fell into a mat retrieving a single shoe, the other shoe that goes with that pair never found, and succumbed to asphyxia because he got stuck. But unlikely, as he is an athletic, able-bodied person. He had enough room to breathe and he had enough room to reposition himself unless there was a reason why he could not move himself once he was in that mat, like being unconscious or injured.
The one theory that I have about the blood being on his shirt and torso area is when you get a bloody nose or a busted lip, it always almost drips up on your shirt, and it wasn't blow splatter like you had stated. It was like droppings.
Yeah. So it just doesn't, it's not a good explanation for how that blood got there below his neckline when he's upside down. So in the case that someone attacked him and put him in this, kind of shoved him in this mat, perhaps, that is a way he could have died from positional asphyxia, but it would have been a homicide regardless whether someone put him in that mat after knocking him unconscious or put him in the mat after they killed him. Somebody got away with murdering him so far.
Exactly.
You know, I'm going to go on a little rant here, but I've seen a number of, like we talked about, it's a very polarizing case, and people who think that Kendrick accidentally fell into this mat and died generally seem to really focus a lot of negative attention and thoughts on the parents and saying that they're out for money. I mean, in my opinion, if you say that Kendrick Johnson's parents are out for money because they're trying to find justice for their son, you should be ashamed of yourself, and you are gross, and I don't want anything to do with you, because that is absolutely ridiculous. We're talking about the most bizarro death situation that I've ever seen, excused away immediately by police and everyone else, and you're telling me that these parents shouldn't fight for justice for their son? I don't think so.
Even people had the audacity to say that the Bills' lives were ruined because of this whole thing. Let's think about the Johnson's family, where their son is dead. He is not coming back. He doesn't have a second chance. He doesn't have a life after this. And you have to go to bed every night wondering if it really was foul play, if someone's out there living a free life knowing that they got away with murder, and you spend money and time and emotion in so much of it, it's just,
it would be terrible, just absolutely horrific.
So
this is how I want to end this discussion on Kendrick Johnson is ask yourself if someone that you loved who was a young, strong, athletic person, whether it be your child, your sibling, your cousin, someone you care about, and they were found dead in a rolled up gym mat with all circumstances that we stated previously as we've discussed this case. You were immediately told that it was an accident because they were retrieving this single shoe. Then what would you do? What would you say? And are you telling me right now that you would seriously accept that determination of death and go on with your life? La-di-da? I don't think so. I really think if this were your child, you would fight for the rest of your life to find out what really happened to him.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this is only going to be a one-part episode, and we don't have much more to offer you because there is so little to find on this case. Literally, what we have talked about today is the only information that we could really find. Like I said, I couldn't even really find his obituary. There was a lot of Kendrick Johnsons, but I couldn't find the Kendrick Johnson I was looking for. So really frustrating to leave it like that.
It is. It's frustrating, and it's just so depressing. It is really a bummer, and to put it mildly, to think that this young man who had so much promise and potential was an upstanding student, citizen, and yet his life was taken from him so tragically and in such a bizarre way, and the case was not handled as it should have been. For whatever reason, it wasn't, and then his parents are supposed to just accept this. So I say no to that, and I know that Shai and I are going to continue to look into this case in the future. I know it's one of the biggest cases that we wanted to start this podcast so we could share, and one day I really, really, truly hope that some information is released that can help explain this death to his family and give them some closure, because as it stands, there's nothing that can give them closure.
Yep.
So that is Kendrick Johnson. That is the end of that story for now. Fingers crossed we can bring you part 2 in the future. But for now, we're done.
For now, until next time, keep it real out there, friends.
Yep. Please, please, please go and share this podcast with your friends and family, anybody that you think may be interested. Share it galore. We would love to get new listeners, and we appreciate all the creeps who have joined us so far. We will talk to you next week when we bring you a new case.
Bye.
Bye.